Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping into a really fascinating essay that gets at a huge question. How do we even begin to build the framework for how we see reality itself?
So let's start with the big one, a question that honestly every single one of us has to answer, whether we think about it or not. How do we make sense of it all? How do all the little pieces of knowledge and life and experience actually fit together into a coherent picture?
You know, there's a really powerful concept for this that comes from German philosophy, Weltanschauung, which literally means worldview. Now, according to our source, this isn't just, a bunch of opinions. It's the widest possible lens your mind can use to try and see everything as one big, ordered whole. You can almost think of it like the operating system running in your brain.
Okay, so what exactly is a worldview, then? And why do our minds seem to automatically try and build one?
Well, the source suggests this impulse comes from two different places. First, there's what it calls the speculative drive. That's just our deep-down need for things to make sense, to connect the dots and create one unified system. But then there's the practical drive. We also need a map of reality to figure out where we stand in it, and maybe, more importantly, how we're supposed to live our lives.
And here's what's so interesting. This whole idea of building a worldview isn't just a religious thing. Not at all. The author makes it really clear that throughout history, philosophers and even scientists have been doing the exact same thing.
I mean, think about it. Way back in ancient Rome, you had the poet Lucretius. He built an entire worldview on one simple but huge idea. Everything that exists is just atoms moving around in empty space. And from that single idea, he tried to explain literally everything else. Or, fast forward a couple thousand years, you have the philosopher Auguste Comte. He came up with a worldview that was totally centered on, us, on man. He basically argued that all knowledge should be used for the progress of humanity, and he even imagined a new kind of religion where humanity itself was what you worshipped.
And we see this even in modern science, right? Take evolutionary theory. It can be used as the foundation for a worldview that tries to explain everything, biology, history, even the human mind, all under one unified set of rules about development.
Okay, so with all that as a backdrop, let's pivot to the main focus of our source here and see how all this builds into the author's definition of the Christian worldview.
According to the author, the Christian worldview isn't some random collection of ideas. Nope, it's a complete logical system that flows from one single core belief, and it all starts with believing that Jesus is the Son of God.
And this slide just lays out the logic perfectly. The argument is that if you accept that first step, it's like a domino effect. You're then committed to a very specific view of God, which leads to a specific view of humanity, which leads to a specific view of sin and redemption, and on right down to human destiny. It's all one connected chain.
So when you have a system that's this complete and interconnected, what happens? Well, according to the author, it inevitably leads to a pretty major conflict with other modern ways of seeing the world.
And the author really doesn't pull any punches here. He says there is a deep and radical antagonism between the Christian worldview and what he calls the modern view of the world. He sees them as being fundamentally at odds. And this conflict, he says, really boils down to one single thing: the supernatural. On one side, you've got a view where a personal God is in charge, history has a purpose, and it all leads to a supernatural person, Christ. And on the other side, you have a purely natural view, where everything is just an unbroken chain of cause and effect with no room for anything miraculous.
So the real debate, according to the author, isn't about, arguing over this or that specific miracle. No, it's much bigger. It's about this whole series of fundamental questions. The core issue is simply this: does a supernatural reality even exist?
Now, the author anticipates that people are going to push back on this whole idea of Christianity being a rigid intellectual system. So he tackles two major objections head-on. Let's look at the first one, the idea that religion is really just about feelings.
You've heard this a million times, right? That Christianity is just a way of life. It's a feeling you have in your heart, and that all this complicated doctrine and intellectual belief just gets in the way of a personal experience. It's about a relationship, not a creed.
But the author really pushes back on this. He says, look, first of all, you can't just feel. You have to feel about something. And that something is an idea. Second, the content of that idea directly shapes the kind of feeling you have. And third, and this is the killer point, if you stop believing the thing you're worshiping is actually real, the religious feeling dies. It just evaporates. Religion, he argues, cannot survive if it's based on an illusion.
Okay, on to the second objection, and this one is a bit more subtle. It's a popular way to try and solve the whole faith versus science debate by basically putting them in two separate, non-overlapping boxes in our heads.
This is the question at the heart of it. Can we hold two ideas that seem to contradict each other at the exact same time, just by saying, well, this one is a religious truth and that one is a scientific truth? This whole idea is sometimes called the doctrine of double truth.
So the distinction goes like this. Theoretic knowledge, science, judges things based on what they objectively are. It asks, what is it? But religious knowledge, in this view, judges things based on what they're worth to us, what they mean for our lives. It asks, what does it mean? They're presented as two totally different ways of knowing that should never cross paths.
But the author's counter is just devastatingly simple. He says, nope, you can't do that. The human mind just doesn't work that way. Your brain, by its very nature, craves coherence. It will always, always insist on bringing all of its knowledge together into one unified system. You simply cannot sustain a mind at war with itself for very long.
And all of this brings us to the author's final, grand conclusion. After defining the Christian worldview, defending it from these major objections, he presents it not as just one more option on the menu, but as the ultimate synthesis of all other ideas.
So his big claim is that other philosophies and worldviews aren't necessarily totally wrong, they just each hold one piece of the puzzle. Christianity, he argues, is the higher harmony that is able to take up all these partial truths and integrate them into a much more complete and coherent picture of reality.
Here's a perfect example. Pantheism says God is absolutely immanent. He's in the world. Deism says God is absolutely transcendent. He's totally separate from the world. These seem like complete opposites, right? Well, the author argues the Christian view synthesizes them, claiming God is somehow both at the same time. It resolves these apparent contradictions by offering a bigger, more comprehensive framework.
And this is his final, powerful declaration. The Christian worldview isn't some kind of buffet where you can pick the parts you like and leave the rest. Nope. It is a single, interconnected, logical system. And in his view, you have to accept the whole thing or you have to reject the whole thing. It stands or it falls together.
So we end by turning this whole thing back on you. The author made a really forceful case for a specific worldview centered on one specific person, but it really forces all of us to ask, what's at the center of our own worldview? Beyond religion, what is that one single foundational idea or principle that holds everything else together for you? That is a question really worth thinking about.